She stared at the mirror on her 18th birthday. 18 years of unanswered questions and broken promises reflected back in her eyes. A pen hovered over a legal document, one signature away from erasing the name she had carried since birth, one signature away from cutting the final tie to a father who had never truly been there. She didn't hesitate. She signed. In that instant, Suri Cruz became Suri Noel Holmes, a young woman who had spent over a decade chasing a father who could leap from airplanes but never found his way home. This isn't the story the tabloids tell, nor the one captured in paparazzi snapshots. It's the untold story of abandonment, silence, and missed birthdays, and the moment a daughter finally decided to stop waiting. But what does it really take to let go of a ghost you've chased your entire life? And can freedom ever feel this heavy? A birth wrapped in silence. To understand where Suri's journey began, you have to go back to a hospital room in Santa Monica on April 18th, 2006. A room that should have been filled with the sounds of new life, of joy, of a mother's first cries mingling with her babies. Instead, there was silence. Katie Holmes lay on the delivery table following Scientology's expectations for a silent birth, a practice the church promoted as beneficial for the child. She held back every sound of pain, every instinct to cry out, while figures in dark suits stood watch in the room. They weren't family. They weren't there to support her. They were there to ensure the rituals were followed precisely. Tom Cruise called it devotion. Katie called it survival. And for Suri, it became the first chapter of a life that would be defined by things she never chose, rules she never understood, and a world that looked perfect from the outside, but felt like a cage from within. During those earliest years, Suri lived inside a carefully constructed fantasy. Red carpets stretched beneath her tiny shoes. Magazine covers featured her cherubic face. Private estates with manicured lawns became her playgrounds. Security teams surrounded her family wherever they went, creating the image of Hollywood royalty living their happiest life. But behind the polished surfaces, cracks were already forming. Katie's parents watched with growing alarm as their daughter became increasingly isolated. Friends noticed that Katie rarely went anywhere alone. Scientology associates seemed to shadow her every movement, appearing at events, standing in hallways, monitoring conversations as if she were living under constant surveillance. Suri was too young to understand any of this. What she knew were simpler things. The sound of footsteps in the hallway. Movie nights curled up between her parents. Strong arms lifting her into the air. A father who seemed larger than life itself, who smiled for cameras and made everyone around him feel like they were standing in the presence of something extraordinary. For 6 years, that was her world. Imperfect behind the scenes, perhaps, but still whole, still complete, still hers. Then came June 2012, and everything shattered. The escape. Katie planned in secret when Katie Holmes filed for divorce just days before Tom Cruise's 50th birthday. The world thought it was a sudden decision, a Hollywood marriage imploding without warning, the way so many others had before. But the truth Suri would only piece together years later, was that her mother had been planning this escape with the precision of a military operation. For months, maybe longer, Katie had lived in a state of constant fear. She changed phones repeatedly, never trusting that her conversations were private. She avoided certain rooms in their home because she believed they were being monitored. She quietly replaced staff members she suspected of reporting her movements back to the Church of Scientology. And every night, she held her daughter a little tighter, terrified that one wrong step could cost her custody, of the only thing that mattered. Katie chose New York as her battleground deliberately. She knew its family court system favored parents seeking to protect a child's stability and well-being. She filed the paperwork while Tom was in Iceland filming Oblivion, timing everything so he would have no warning, no opportunity to counter her moves before they were already in motion. He discovered the divorce the same way the rest of the world did, through headlines, through breaking news alerts, through the sudden realization that the woman he thought he controlled had been planning her freedom for months without him ever suspecting. For a man who had spent decades maintaining absolute control over his public image, this was a blow that cut deeper than any failed stunt. Court documents later revealed what Katie had fought for above everything else: the right to raise Suri outside of Scientology. Former members of the church had spoken publicly about their fears that children of prominent members could be pushed into the Sea Organization, the church's most demanding and restrictive program. Katie was determined to ensure her daughter would never face that future. To prevent it, she was willing to sacrifice everything: her career, her friendships, her privacy, her safety. All of it was worth less than her daughter's freedom. By July 2012, only 11 days after filing, the divorce was finalized. The speed was almost unprecedented for a celebrity case of this magnitude. Tom agreed to pay approximately $400,000 a year in child support, cover all medical and educational expenses, and accept that Katie would have full custody. The money meant nothing to Katie. Freedom was the only currency that mattered. The next day, she and Suri left Los Angeles like ghosts slipping through walls. They arrived in New York City with a few suitcases and the desperate hope that 3,000 miles of distance could save them from everything they were leaving behind. For 6-year-old Suri, the move felt like waking up in a different universe. Her father's face appeared everywhere she looked: on movie posters, on magazine covers, on television screens playing trailers for his latest blockbuster. He was omnipresent in the world around her, yet completely absent from the seat beside her. The man who once held her hand on Manhattan sidewalks had become nothing more than an image, a ghost made of light and celluloid. Growing up with an invisible father. For most children, memories of their father come from ordinary moments. Bedtime stories read in sleepy voices, weekend trips to nowhere in particular, school plays where dad sits in the third row with a camera he doesn't quite know how to operate. These small moments accumulate into something solid, something a child can hold on to when life gets hard. Suri's memories were different. Hers were fading snapshots from before she turned 6, preserved like photographs left too long in sunlight, the colors slowly draining away. She remembered warmth. She remembered laughter. She remembered feeling complete. But with each passing year, those memories grew hazier, replaced by something colder and more persistent: the silence. After the move to New York, Katie built a quiet routine designed entirely around protecting her daughter. She walked Suri to school every morning. She cooked simple dinners in their apartment. She helped with homework at the kitchen table, patient and present in ways that only a parent who has fought for their child can truly understand. But there was one thing even Katie's fierce protection couldn't shield Suri from: the absence that grew louder with every passing year. Suri watched her father from a distance no child should ever have to maintain. She saw him hanging off skyscrapers in action sequences that made audiences gasp. She saw him racing through explosions, performing stunts that no other actor in Hollywood dared to attempt. She saw his face on billboards, in bookstores, on the sides of buses rolling through the city streets. He was everywhere. Everywhere, except in her life. And that absence carried a weight that grew heavier with every birthday that passed without a message, without a phone call, without a single sign that he remembered the little girl he once called a miracle. When Suri turned 10, the questions inside her began to sharpen. Where is Dad slowly transformed into, why doesn't he come? She tried to comfort herself with explanations that made sense to a child's heart. He's busy. He's saving the world on screen. He'll come when he can. But even children eventually understand the difference between a schedule and a choice. Her father wasn't absent because of time constraints. He was absent because something, or someone, had convinced him to stay away. By her early teens, the contrast became impossible to ignore. She noticed her friends being picked up by their fathers after school plays and sports practices. She stood at the curb waiting for her mother, pretending she didn't mind. Pretending the sight of other dads hugging their daughters didn't make something twist inside her chest. She learned emotional independence not by choice, but by necessity. She rode the subway alone. She finished school projects without anyone checking her work. She carried her disappointments in silence, so her mother wouldn't see them and worry more than she already did. The media continued to speculate throughout those years. Reports circulated that Tom had seen Suri only once after the divorce in 2012. After that single visit, there were no confirmed meetings, no photographs, no evidence that father and daughter had shared the same space in years. To the world, it became a mystery, a Hollywood curiosity to discuss in gossip columns and entertainment podcasts. To Suri, it was simply her life. A life shaped by a father who felt more like a rumor than a memory. And yet, even in the emptiness of those years, she never learned how to hate him. Children don't hate. Children ache. And Suri ached in ways she wouldn't fully understand until she was old enough to search for answers on her own. The truth she discovered in isolation. When the pandemic shut down the world in 2020, Suri was 14 years old. For most teenagers, that period of isolation meant boredom, video calls with friends, and too much time scrolling through social media. For Suri, it meant something different. It meant finally having the space and the silence to search for the truth that no one had ever fully explained to her. She had grown up hearing fragments of adult conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered the room. Whispered words she caught before bedroom doors closed: Scientology, custody, control, restrictions. She had absorbed these fragments without understanding them, storing them away in a part of her mind that wasn't ready to process their meaning. But at 14, alone in her room with the world frozen outside her window, she finally began to look. She read interviews with former Scientology members. She watched documentaries that laid out the church's practices in clinical detail. She found testimonies from people who had lost family members after leaving the organization, people who described being cut off from parents, siblings, and children because of policies that demanded loyalty above all else. Suri wasn't mentioned by name in any of these accounts. She wasn't old enough or prominent enough to be a subject of direct discussion. But she saw herself reflected between the lines. She recognized the patterns. She understood what it meant to be on the outside of something that demanded total allegiance from those on the inside. Former members had described being discouraged from maintaining relationships with people who left the church or refused involvement. Some had spoken about losing contact with their own children. The organization, they said, created invisible walls between families. Suri began to understand her own story through their words. She wasn't a threat. She was just a child. She was a child who lived outside, and outside meant distance. Outside meant separation. Outside meant a father who could not or would not cross a line drawn by something bigger than love. That realization broke something inside her that had been holding together for years. She hadn't grown up hating Tom Cruise. She had grown up waiting for him, waiting for a birthday card that never arrived, waiting for a phone call that never came, waiting for a moment when he would walk through a door and choose her over everything else in his complicated life. She had been standing in that doorway for 12 years, listening for footsteps she would never hear again. At 15, she walked into the kitchen one morning and found her mother quietly wiping tears from her eyes after reading an article about Tom's latest film premiere. The two of them looked at each other across the room, and neither spoke. They didn't need to. The truth between them had always been heavy. Katie had carried the weight of her daughter's abandonment alone for years, protecting Suri from the full force of it, absorbing the pain so her child wouldn't have to. Katie never spoke badly about Tom, not once. She never used bitterness as a weapon or filled Suri's head with resentment. Instead, she held on to one guiding principle. Some truths are too painful to give a child before they're ready. By 16, Suri was finally ready. Not for the media's version of her story, not for the tabloid speculation or the gossip column theories. She was ready for her own truth, the one she had been building piece by piece in the quiet of her room, in the silence of her father's absence, in the space between who she was and who she was becoming. The day she chose her own name. April 2024 arrived like any other spring in New York. Trees bloomed along the avenues. Students rushed between classes with coffee cups in hand. The city moved forward the way it always did, indifferent to the significance of any single moment. But for Suri, turning 18 was not just a birthday. It was a breaking point. It was the day the law finally recognized her as someone who could make her own decisions, speak her own truth, and define her identity without permission from anyone, including the man whose name she had carried since birth. In the weeks before her birthday, she had been working on her college application essays, pouring years of silence onto the page. One sentence in particular captured everything she had felt since she was 6 years old. Sometimes we don't grow up with love. We grow up with the space that love leaves behind. She didn't mention her father by name. She didn't need to. The entire world knew who she meant. But for the first time, the story belonged to her. While other teenagers celebrated their 18th birthdays with parties and presents, Suri spent hers in a quieter way. She stood in front of a mirror and saw a young woman who had spent half her life grieving someone who was still alive. She realized she no longer needed to wait for a phone call that never came. She no longer needed to check her mailbox on her birthday, hoping for a card. She no longer needed to carry the weight of someone else's choices. That was the day she made a decision that would change everything. On May 17, 2024, Suri signed the paperwork to legally change her name. She chose Suri Noel Holmes, taking her mother's middle name as a tribute to the woman who had carried her through 12 years of storms, the woman who had sacrificed everything to give her daughter a chance at a normal life. She expected to cry when she signed the documents. She didn't. Instead, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: relief. The kind of relief that comes when you finally stop holding onto a rope. The world noticed the change immediately. Her new name appeared in her high school graduation program. It appeared on the cast list when she performed in her school's production of the Addams Family musical. It appeared on her acceptance documents for Carnegie Mellon University, where she would begin studying fashion design in the fall. People called it an act of rebellion. Media outlets framed it as a dramatic rejection of her father. But that wasn't what it was at all. It wasn't anger. It wasn't revenge. It was simply a young woman choosing to define herself on her own terms for the first time in her life. It was freedom. The kind of freedom that only comes after surviving years of silence. Building a life without his shadow. By the time Suri started her freshman year at Carnegie Mellon in the fall of 2024, she had already completed a transformation that had been building for over a decade. She was no longer the child whose every step was photographed by paparazzi. No longer the girl the world pitied for growing up without her famous father. No longer the symbol of a marriage that Hollywood once believed would last forever. She was simply a young woman studying fashion, riding the subway between Pittsburgh and New York, like millions of other students, living a life finally untouched by the pressure of her old name. Katie visited often during those early months, helping her move into her dorm room, carrying boxes up narrow staircases with tired hands and a smile that held years of gratitude. She had done the impossible. She had raised a daughter who survived fame, survived abandonment, survived the suffocating weight of a celebrity father's silence, and still emerged as a grounded, kind, driven human being. In interviews, Katie said only one thing about her daughter. She's an incredible person. But anyone who understood their story knew that Suri's resilience came directly from her mother. Every ounce of strength she possessed had been modeled by a woman who chose courage over comfort at every turn. Meanwhile, Tom Cruise continued living a life of extremes. He filmed major franchises that broke box office records. He prepared for projects that pushed the boundaries of what cinema could achieve, including plans to shoot footage in actual outer space. He signed multi-million-dollar deals that cemented his status as one of the most bankable stars in Hollywood history. He performed stunts that made audiences hold their breath, leaping from buildings, clinging to the sides of airplanes, racing motorcycles off cliffs. The world cheered every time he risked his life on screen. Every death-defying moment became a headline, a viral clip, a testament to his commitment to his craft. But what he never risked, not once in over a decade, was walking across a room to rebuild a relationship with the daughter who once adored him. Sources close to the family say he still pays for Suri's education and medical expenses, fulfilling the obligations outlined in the 2012 settlement. But he has not been photographed with her since she was 6 years old. According to those who would know, there have been no private visits, no phone calls, no attempts to close the distance that has grown between them year after year. Suri, now 19, has accepted that silence. She no longer expects her father to appear at her doorstep. She no longer checks her phone on her birthday, hoping for a message that never comes. She no longer stands at the window of her memory, waiting for footsteps that stopped echoing 12 years ago. Instead, she carries on building her own identity, her own dreams. The little girl who once cried into her hands when no one was watching now walks confidently into adulthood with the name she chose for herself. Suri Noel Holmes. Suri Cruz's story doesn't end with a signature. It's a quiet revolution, a reclaiming of identity in a world that measured her by absence. She walks through life in the shadow of one of the biggest stars on the planet, yet she carries a freedom that no red carpet or headline could ever grant. But how do you reconcile the child who once waited for a father with the woman who no longer needs him? And what truths remain hidden behind the doors of fame, privilege, and silence? The questions linger, and the next chapter of choices, consequences, and the private battles of those in the public eye is just beginning.